So, a few years ago, I spotted a trend. A lot of my friends had moved from being senior designers to lead designers to running a team, to running a department. Some of them even graduated to being heads, directors, CEOs of the whole company. They'd finally got that seat at the table they'd been desperately fighting for. But rather than being happy as you'd expect, they were more stressed than ever before. They'd hoped that somehow becoming a design leader would have solved all the problems they'd experienced as an individual contributor, when in fact all it had done is just created a whole bunch of new problems. Problems they've never had to deal with before or even think about. They'd sort of fallen for this myth of leadership that somehow all you needed is power to make things better. That sometimes it would just magically improve. However, it turned out that power and authority wasn't enough. Power might give you the opportunity to influence, but power alone didn't cut it. Instead, you needed to develop a whole new set of skills, which I'll be talking about a little bit later in this presentation. So as I talked to my friends over tea and cake, well, I am British, a pattern started emerging. It was like I was having the same conversation over and over again, Groundhog Day style. All my friends had the same problems. They found themselves in companies that actually really valued design. And that's actually the reason why they'd been brought in to kind of build and grow the design teams. That sounded great in the interview, but in practice it was proving problematic. They were getting inundated by resumes, but few of the people that were applying had the level of skills that they were looking for. Most were just 18 months out of a general assembly course and not really at the level that they needed. If they did find the right level of talent, people would only stick around for 18 months before being attracted to that next opportunity. As a result, my friends weren't really managers, they were really hiring managers, spending all their time just recruiting, reading CVs, reading resumes, running interviews. If they did somehow manage to build that perfect team, that team just weren't executing, at least at any level that they were expecting. In fact, it felt like everything had been taking longer than it did before. The bigger the team, it seemed like things just slowed down. This was especially true for many of my friends that had come from an agency background. It seemed like what they were used to doing in 8 months would take them 18. Another common problem my friends found was the need to manage upwards. It was all very well having a seat at the table, but often it was seen as a high chair. Marketing had the budget, IT had the power, and the designer was sat in the corner playing with their crayons. It turns out that most organizations really focus their attention where their money is. So if you've got 100 developers with a high salary count, if you've got a marketing team with millions being spent on above-the-line advertising, then a small design team often gets ignored. Managing up has suddenly taken up so much of their time trying to prove the value of design around the organization that they just didn't have time to look after the rest of their team. This is probably one of the reasons why the turnover was so high. In many cases, this was their first time they've been a manager, and for many organizations, it was the first time they'd had a design manager. So they were having to build everything from scratch. They were having to build progression frameworks. They were having to design interview processes. It was just chaos. As a result, my friends were feeling stressed, they were feeling burned out, and they were wondering whether they made some kind of terrible mistake. Maybe management wasn't for them. Maybe they should go back to being an individual contributor. I'm sure we've all felt similar feelings at some stage. The idea that sometimes or somewhere someone will come and unmask you, Scooby-Doo style, for the fraud that you really are. So you spend your whole time just hoping that no one kind of discovers you don't really know what you're doing. This is actually called the Valley of Despair. It's this sort of idea of imposter syndrome. So design leadership is a relatively new activity. We've had technologists and marketers at board level for as long as I can remember. However, design representation at any senior level is relatively new. I think in the UK, we might have 1 or 2 board level designers out of all of the the hundreds and thousands of companies we have in the UK. In fact, most companies are lucky if they've got a director level or VP level design lead, let alone that mythical chief design officer. So can I just get a quick show of hands? How many people in the room would count themselves as a leader of some sort, design or technology? I'd like to see a show of hands. Okay, so that's probably about a third of the room. So this talk is mostly for you. You're my primary audience. Now, secondary audience, who has a leader? Who has a boss? Okay, this is also for you. So what I'm hoping to do, if you are a leader or wanting to become a leader, this will show you sort of like what good skills look like. If you have a leader, this will hopefully show you all the amazing things they're doing. And if they're not doing it, hopefully this will help you hold them to account. So I've been an accidental leader myself for the last 14 years. I say accidental because I never set out to become a leader. I started an agency, I was a designer. And then all of a sudden I woke up and I have 30 people whose lives, whose responsibilities, whose mortgages are my responsibility. And I expect a majority of the people who are leaders in the room feel the same way. So I realized about 3 years ago, which is probably about 7, 8, 9 years too late, that I needed to professionalize. I needed to get better at being a leader. And so the first thing I did is start a Slack community. And this was a great opportunity to talk to tens, hundreds, now I think the Slack community is about 11, 1,200 sort of design leaders, to figure out how they did it well so I could kind of steal all their ideas. I also started a design leadership conference called Leading Design. It started in London. I think the next one is in beginning of November. And now we've moved to New York and San Francisco. And again, it was just a really cheeky ploy. Like, what's the best way that I can learn to be a good leader? I'll just bring a whole bunch of people into a room and learn from them. So if you are interested in any of this stuff, then you can find out a little bit more over here. As I said, I never set out to be a design leader. I mean, who dreams of, as a kid of like growing up to be a manager? I was part of Generation X. I sort of looked at movies like Office Space and thought, the managers were the enemy. I was a kind of a rebellious young designer and I didn't want to be there. And so one day I woke up and I found that actually I was the enemy. Some days I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job. Other days I feel like I'm the living embodiment of the Peter Principle, the idea that you rise to the level of your own incompetence. That might sound a little bit harsh, but somewhat deliberate. I'll explain. When I started Clearleft, I hated the sort of classic model of leadership. The superstar designer in the black polo neck that kind of like surrounded themselves with psychopathic juniors that would do everything that they wanted, jump at every need. This was the classic kind of design god role of leadership, the sort of Mad Men approach. And I hated it. I really wanted to do anything but. This traditional approach of leadership kind of puts the leader above everybody else. You stand on the shoulders of the rest of your team, and that gives you a view over everything that's coming. But what it also does is it puts pressure on the shoulders of everyone you're standing upon. And that pressure, over time, can start crushing people. It was never a model that attracted me. Instead, I found myself adopting something that I later learned was called servant leadership. In a book entitled Orbiting the Big Giant Hairball, which I think is the weirdest name for a design leadership book ever, they talk about creative leadership being more like a giant fruit tree. The leaders are the trunks, the roots, the branches of the tree, providing support, nutrition, and stability. And your team are the fruits of the tree. And your job as a leader is to raise these fruits up to the sun and help them grow, help them mature. Your job is to carry their weight on your shoulders, not vice versa. For me, this was a much more attractive model of design. An idea that you hire people better than you, and then you give them a great organization and a great environment to do amazing work, and then you give them the space and step out of their way. So this is the model I tried to adopt. It seemed like the most grown-up model. It prioritized organizational learning and growth over the leader's personal ego needs. Now, I believe that our industry really is a talent-led industry. So a leader's primary role is to find and nurture talent. In short, a great leader needs to become a talent scout, constantly looking out for that next great hire, whether you've got an open role or not. It sounds glib, but the easiest way to hire an amazing team of people is to create a team that people want to be on. If it's an internal team, you want to build a team that attracts the best talent, that does the best work, that every other person in the company wants to go and work with. You also want to have a team where people have fun and, more importantly, grow. It's an opportunity for people to do the best work of their career. In order to do this, design leaders need to step away from the office, they need to step away from the meeting room and actually be part of the wider community. If you're an internal leader, you need to be going out and promoting your teams throughout the organization, doing talks, doing brown bags, doing show and tells. If you're running a smaller company, you need to get out into the community, speak at local events, speak at national conferences, speak at international conferences, write. This is the way that you attract the best talent. Now, it's important, I think, in the creative industry to realize that salary is just table stakes. There's loads of research that shows, below a certain salary threshold, salary is important, but above that threshold, it's other things like learning, like growth, like having a mission. So you've got to make sure that you set a reasonable salary, but that's not the thing that's going to motivate your team. The thing that's going to motivate your team is interesting challenges and the opportunity for growth. And this produces a network effect. If you and your team members are doing this, then everyone else will want to be part of it. So I suggest hiring great designers early on, because great designers attract other great designers, and that's the best way to grow. You also need to signal to the community, and particularly your internal community, that you invest in people. Things like generous conference budgets, things like bringing external speakers, organising brown bag lunches, having visiting lecturers, going to do in-house workshops, going and travelling up to museums. All of these things are really, really important. The number of companies that I see that don't invest in staff and almost treat a conference budget like it's some kind of gift. Oh, you've done really well this year. You can have the one conference ticket that we're going to give to the 30-person team this year. That's not a great way of motivating your team. There's this whole idea, there's an apocryphal story of a manager saying to a staff member, well, what happens if I send a staff member to a conference and they leave? And the answer is, what if you don't and they stay? You want to have the smartest, most trained people possible. You don't want to drive people away. You don't want to have people that are not interested in growing their own education sticking around. So you need to create an amazing physical environment. So people spend more time at work than they do at home often. And so investing in the physical space. I'm not necessarily talking like pool tables and kind of like slides to get down different levels of the office. But I've been into offices where it's just not practical to work as a designer. Well, you're not allowed to stick things on the wall. Like, if you stick things on the wall, the cleaners will rip stuff off at the end of the day. Like, there's some really ugly pictures on the wall that maybe the MD liked or even their partner painted. And you're not allowed to take them off because, it ruins the aesthetic. I worked with a big fashion brand that was exactly like that. And the designers had to, take their beautiful sticky notes off every night and post them back up again because they were told that they'd be thrown in the bin. This is not a great way to manage an environment. So weirdly, being a leader, design or development, a lot of the time you end up having battles with random people like facilities people to make sure you've got the right space. Like, you've got a meeting room that you can go back to, a war room, a workshop room. I think it's also important to hire slowly. Because if you hire the wrong person, even one person can drive away all of your talent. It can really, really drive down morale. So this is whole idea of hiring slow and avoiding brilliant arseholes. I'm sure we've all worked with people who are amazing, who are like the 10x developer, but piss everybody else off. I would rather have a team of 1x developers who are nice and get on than one sort of toxic 10x developer. Steve Jobs used to say, it's better to have a hole than an arsehole, which I think is ironic if people know about Steve Jobs' management style. So I've come to this conclusion that, like most organisms, every company just has one arsehole. You also need to make sure that you've got a good balance of people. One of the weird things is, when you're hiring amazing talent, you hire all these pioneers, all these kind of edgy kind of startup people, then you give them a job that's optimizing your checkout process, and they get bored really, really quickly. So rather than just stacking the deck with kind of these innovative pioneers, you need to realize you need a balance. There's this idea of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. I generally think maybe for most companies, you need 10 or 20% of pioneers, the innovators that are going to build the next generation of tools. You then need maybe 10% of town planners, the managers, the admin people, the ops people, to make sure that the space works. 70% of your team need to be happy taking what has been built and growing it and growing that value. So a lot of my friends kind of end up being stuck where they've got a load of people that leave really, really quickly because, they look at what's happening now, they look at what's happening in the next 18 months, it's exactly the same, and they get bored and leave. So this brings us on to retaining talent. You've got an amazing team. How do you keep people for longer than 18 months? In fact, in San Francisco, the average time for moving for designers and developers is about 9 months. You see people that have been out of a General Assembly course for 3 years, and they've done Google, Facebook, Airbnb, and Uber in 3 years. It's bonkers. So one of your jobs as a leader of any sort is to keep people on team. And I should add, when I talk about leader, I'm not necessarily talking about manager. I'm very, very specific talking about leadership. You don't have to have the authority. You don't have to have a title to be a leader. You all know there's one person in your team that if something breaks, if you need help, you will go to. Sometimes that is the person with the official managerial title. Sometimes it's the person that's been there longest. Sometimes it's just the person that takes all the shit that everyone else kind of gives them and sorts stuff out. So leadership isn't a title that's conferred, it's an attitude. So I think all of you in this room can be and probably are leaders if you're coming to events like this. So, like I say, one of the biggest reasons people leave jobs early is because they were sold this amazing culture of collaboration and learning. And they get in there day one, and often they're just thrown in the deep end. You know, there's no onboarding, you know, there's no hello, they're just thrown in. And it turns out that what they've been promised isn't really the culture, it's like a wish list for management. So one of your jobs as a design leader isn't just to sell the culture to onboarding people, but to make sure that that culture is actually genuine and that you live that culture every single day. They talk about culture being the behaviors that are acceptable or not tolerated by leadership. So, you know, if you say that you're relaxed about when people come into the office, or, you know, you've got your flexible office time, and then you as a leader are there bang on 9 o'clock and leave bang on 5 o'clock and have a go at people if they don't do the same, then you're not sort of setting a good example. Purpose is a big thing when it comes to kind of leadership. You really need to, if you don't have a company or a team that has a set of values, that has a core goal, that has a mission, then that's one of the first things you probably need to do as a leader. And most companies have sort of missions and purposes, and I think most teams should have as well. Even in small teams, you might want to have like some kind of mandate that says, this is what the team does, this is what the team doesn't do, this is how we behave, this is what's acceptable, this isn't acceptable. If people believe they're doing something meaningful, they're much more likely to stay. They're also much more likely to stay if they're surrounded by friends. A great way to retain and motivate people, therefore, is to foster a sense of community and collaboration. If people are surrounded by colleagues, if people are surrounded by family, they're much more likely to stay because they care for those people. Partly because they feel this sort of family commitment, partly because they just don't want to let their team down. This sort of means creating, if you can, a sort of tight social network. A very common way of doing this is like having the classic Silicon Valley sort of ping pong table and beer pong at the end of the day, and going for sort of big work trips at the weekend. And that might work if you're in your 20s. But actually it can be really, really damaging. If you're in your 30s, if you're in your 40s, if you've got family, being able to commit to kind of doing stuff out of hours is really challenging. Not everyone wants to go and hang out and get drunk and do tequila shots with the CEO. So I'm sure most of you in this room are probably not in companies like that, but I see this all the time in San Francisco. So if you're trying to build culture, make sure you do it in a way that respects people's times. People have lives, people have commitments, and you don't want to get into this sort of weird situation where the people that end up progressing through the ranks are the younger ones that can kind of hang out and, like I say, do tequila shots with the CEO while you're doing the school run. Now, there are lots of reasons why people leave companies. It turns out the biggest reason is probably you. So specifically, people leave companies because of bad management. And if you are a manager of the company or a team and you see a lot of people leaving, you have to start asking yourself, how am I contributing to this? And what can I do to prevent this? This can be painful, it can be challenging to your ego, but it's an important learning experience. So just be aware of the effect that you are having on people, because it's kind of interesting, like, when one of your colleagues says, I'm going to do this, you just take it as a suggestion. If your boss, if your manager says something, even if they mean it as a throwaway comment, I've seen teams that have gone away and spent 3 months building a thing just because a manager said it in a throwaway comment. They didn't really mean go away and spend all that time doing it. Managers have an amazing amount of power, and a lot of the time they need to be respectful of when they say to do something. They've got to be really clear about communicating, whether it's a suggestion, whether it's a recommendation, whether it's a command. Another reason people get, sort of leave is because they get bored, they get burnt out. They look at the last 18 months backlog, and then they look at the next 18 months backlog, and it's exactly the same. And they just kind of find that on this like hamster wheel, kind of like treadmill of death. And after the first sort of 6 or 9 or 18 months, they've learned everything there is to learn about the company, they've solved all the interesting problems, and it's time to move on. So your job as a team, as leaders, is to try and create that sort of sense of innovation. And that might be, like I said earlier, like bringing external speakers in, etc. It might be doing things like having 20% time. Something we do at Clearleft is every year we take the whole team away, we hire a house in the countryside, and we have like a hack week where people work on their own personal projects, and it's really good fun. And so whatever you need to do to kind of break up that kind of sort of, that grind, I think is really helpful. And so, like I say, schedule time to experiment. In my experience, good designers are happy spending all their day perfecting their designs. They love the craft of design, and they're happiest when they're designing. Really great designers want to ship. They want to create designs that get into the hands of their users, their customers, as quickly as possible. They want to see their work being used. Great designers get super frustrated when it takes too long to ship. I know so many designers that have left companies because the product hasn't shipped or it's been cancelled, and they just get frustrated and leave. So again, one of your biggest jobs as a design leader is to help people execute at pace. And this is challenging. You know, as a leader, your job is to try and remove barriers. Actually, that's one of the biggest jobs, I think, and one of the things that most design leaders don't realize. Their job is just running around, having sort of battles, getting resources, you know, trying to remove all these barriers. And helping their teams deliver faster at a higher standard. We've heard a lot sort of yesterday, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more today about the power of design systems. I think design systems are a huge productivity boost. They can also contribute to kind of designer burnout, because again, if you're not creating things from scratch, it can get a little bit sort of tiring. But they can be really useful. Design systems falls into this new sort of process of design operations, where we're trying to operationalize design, we're trying to scale design. And so I would say if you've got, if you've got a team of 20 to 30 people, you need to start thinking about building out an operations team. This can be an individual role, this can be the responsibility of a few people, or in large organizations, this can be a whole team. Now, a lot of design leaders feel that they're too good to kind of get involved in the detail. I think it's important for design leaders to show humility, to walk the floors and to pick up the trash. If your team are really stressed, if they're really pushing for a deadline, you should be the one that's kind of like, making people tea, going out and buying donuts, changing the water, basically doing all the mundane stuff to allow your team to do the things that are really important. So I don't think whether you're a VP or a CEO, there's any job in the company too small for you to do. It shows your team members you're willing to roll up your hands and or roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. And it's an example other people will follow. If you walk past something, if you walk past a bunch of trash or a messy table and you leave it, that sends a message to everyone that that's fine behavior. So you set the standard. So I think we heard yesterday a little bit about Project Aristotle. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but Project Aristotle from Google, I'm sure most of you know, they did a survey around all the Google teams to figure out what contributed to the highest performing teams. And they created this sort of following list. I've already mentioned impact and meaning, structure and clarity, and sort of dependability of the team, the sense of you're part of a family. The number one indicator of performance was psychological safety. This idea that you're in a safe space, that you can say something, you can disagree with management, and it's not going to affect your standing in the organization, it's not going to affect your ability to progress. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think psychological safety, creating a safe space for your team, is vitally important. So you've got a great, high-performing team, they're sticking around, they're growing. In order to support that team, you need to make sure they have enough resources. You need to make sure they've got the right structure. You need to make sure they're being put on the right kind of projects. They also need to know that the rest of the organization values them. It's important for them to feel that they're valued members of the company. After all, if your designers are constantly having to badger you for resources or even just justify their own existence, very little quality work will get done. As such, it's your job as leaders to promote the value of design around the whole organization. And this can be done in a dozen different ways. It can be, like I say, organizing lunch and learns. It can be doing company-wide sort of workshops. It can be taking people away for sort of retreats, et cetera, regular crit sessions. I knew a friend of mine that worked in a 1,000-person or maybe 2,000-person company. They had 4 designers. They couldn't do all the work that was necessary. So every Thursday, they set up a little table, and it was like, come to us every Thursday for an hour with your design problems. We'll try and help you. So there are loads of ways of trying to kind of share the power of design around organisations. I think GDS, Government Digital Service in the UK, have done a great job. Half of their effort was like pasting up posters around the organisation, selling the value of design. Facebook do this as well. Facebook have their own like silkscreen printing department that prints posters around the culture and pastes them up around the organisation. Designers have such a strong belief in the power of design that they often get frustrated when people don't immediately see what's obvious to them. As a result, I have to say, designers can be a real pain in the ass to work with. If you're a developer, you probably realize this. If you're a product manager, oh my God, my heart bleeds for you. But it's because designers love what they do, they're passionate people. And for them, it's really easy to get drawn into sort of opinion battles. All I can say is it's really important to know which battles are important to fight and which battles aren't. You know, there's the old saying that you trap more flies with honey. Technically, it's not true. Oh, sorry, you've trapped more flies with honey than vinegar. Technically, it's not true. Apparently, you actually trap more flies with vinegar than honey, but I'm not going to mess with that old wives' tale. But basically, try and be nice. Try and show the power of design to your organization. Don't be the kind of the annoying kind of like stressy people in the corner. It doesn't do us as an industry any good. One way of helping to operationalize design, apart from kind of building a design ops team, is to try and weave design through the governance layer of your organization. So design isn't just people that take orders and then deliver on things. Designers are actually involved in the commissioning of projects, the evaluating of projects, the delivering of projects. GDS, again, did this in a really amazing way by producing this kind of digital service standards manual that basically became law around the organization. They produced this big manual that said, if you want to deliver or if you want to commission a project, these are the steps you take, these are the resources you need, these are the sign-off processes. And once things become governance, they just become natural. You don't sort of challenge them. Another one of my friends worked with a big, I actually won't say who it was, but with a big company in the UK. And he was asked, because he was a head of design, oh, couldn't you just like redesign this Word document form? And he thought, well, it's kind of a bit below me, but yeah, you know, let me know what it is. And it was the document they used for the executives to commission new projects. He was like, well, this is great. I think the person that gave it to him just thought they might make the lines and the typography a bit different. But he completely changed the form. And one of the things he did is, for every business KPI, he insisted that the stakeholder added a user KPI. So, you know, for every time they said, well, we want to have, you know, this metric increased by 2%. Like we want to kind of increase click-throughs or whatever. They would also have a corollary of a user KPI to kind of like balance things. And this was just a little bit of kind of like, you know, kung fu to try and get the stakeholders thinking more about the user. So you can do a lot of this stuff. You can like slip things into the governance layer of your organization without them really, really knowing, just by being helpful and helping design some of the materials. So another skill of a designer is basically to protect your team. There's this whole idea of being a shit umbrella rather than being a shit funnel. When I say a shit umbrella, I don't mean an umbrella that's rubbish. I mean an umbrella to protect the team from the hose pipe of crap that keeps hitting them. So many of my friends go into large companies and find their whole day is consumed with, you know, difficult Slack conversations and emails and meeting after meeting after meeting, and they end up like having all of their productivity destroyed. Your job is to be that barrier. Your job is to create the space for them to get on work. And unfortunately, that means you're going to get a little bit messy, but you need to be that umbrella to protect people. This is one of the reasons why actually kind of, you know, leadership can be quite isolating, because you're there protecting everybody else. Everyone else often doesn't know all of the crap you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So it can be tough. Because of this, leaders really need help. A lot of the people that I know are leaders, you know, in front of their team, they look like the sort of the happiest, kind of most confident people in the world, but inside they're stressed. You know, their team are asking them for loads of things that are impossible. The leadership are asking them for loads of things that are impossible. And they have no other peers around the organization they can talk to. This is why leadership Slack channels, this is why conferences are really, really helpful. It's also why coaching is really important. So I recommend to any leader or budding leader in the room, if you are in that position, reach out and get a leadership coach. It's super helpful. It will help you understand how you navigate corporate politics. It will help you manage up. It will be really helpful. Okay, you've done with the managing up, it's time to manage down. A lot of managers are so focused on managing upwards that they forget their team. So don't spend your whole time managing up. It's hard managing people who give a shit. As I said before, designers are really, really passionate people. It can be tough. So you've got to dig in. But a good leader takes interest in their team. They understand what's going on in their lives. They understand their family's names. They understand what's working well, what's working badly, and they're there for them. And one way of doing this is making sure you've got regular one-on-ones. Now, a lot of people have one-on-ones, but it's all very kind of like, business focused. It's all very much focused around what that person's working on that day. But you also need to create time to talk to individuals about their career goals, their aspirations, what's working well, what's stressing them out. You are their coach, you are their guide. This is essential. You also need to give time to connect with people. We've all worked with that busy manager that you only ever see every now and again. You see them at meetings, you see them rushing between meetings, you've got a really important thing to say to them, and they never have time. They promise they'll talk to you, and then 2 weeks later they haven't. It's your responsibility to walk the halls. It's your responsibility to loiter. One of my favourite things is every couple of days I just go and hang around the coffee area, making tea and coffee and chatting to people. And you'll be amazed what happens when you just take interest in people. Oh, what are you doing over there? And then they show you their work, and then you connect and you bond. So create that space. When you do see something that doesn't quite work, give feedback then and there. Make it actionable. Don't wait for 2 or 3 weeks. Don't give the whole shit sandwich, which is a good thing, a bad thing, a good thing. Just be direct. Just tell people what they did wrong and give them feedback. And the goal is to try and, to follow Kim Scott's book. If you've read Kim Scott's Radical Candor, try and be radically candid. Try and care personally and challenge directly. If you challenge but you don't care, you become obnoxious and aggressive. If you care but don't challenge, you do what Brits do, which is ruinous empathy. Also be aware that there are multiple ways of managing teams. There's not just one way. For some people, you can be a coach. For some people, you can delegate. For some people, you can direct. And also make sure when you're giving feedback, you don't just dive straight in. Sometimes the best thing to do is this non-directive questioning. So ask people how they might do something rather than tell them that they've done it wrong. And I also think it's really important to praise publicly but critique privately. I worked with a company where they basically had these big all-hands meetings, and they bring people up on stage and then rip their work to pieces. And you can imagine the feeling that would have of, fear and terror. It was amazing that on that day, it happened like once a month, I think. The number of people that were sick that day was crazy because people were just afraid. So praise publicly and praise a lot. Praise much more than you do critique. If you do that, then people will take the critique seriously. And all the reason we're doing this is to kind of support individual team growth. The number of teams I see that don't have any structured kind of growth mechanism, a growth ladder. This is just a sample of a common growth ladder. It just says if you're a lead, these are the behaviors we expect for you. If you're a principal, if you're a director, actually there's a whole bunch of these publicly available. Clearleft released our own internal competency matrix a while ago, so I'll tweet out some lists afterwards. Another challenge is if you have an amazing team, you provide autonomy, but where's the accountability? There's this thing called the accountability ladder, and I see a lot of teams behaving in this way. If something goes wrong, they're unaware of it, they blame others, they come up with excuses, they wait and think it's somebody else's responsibility. If you are a true leader, you acknowledge the reality, you own the problem, you try and find solutions, and you just get on with it. So sometimes I find this accountability a little bit negative. So there's this corollary, which is the leadership ladder. So from a leadership sort of perspective, I want my staff to be at the top. I want my staff to come to me and say, I've been doing this, or I've done, or I intend to do, not tell me what to do, or I think. I think and tell me what to do shows hopelessness, whereas I've been doing and I've done shows accountability. So I know I'm a little bit over. I'm almost finished. These were the sort of 5 key concerns I see repeating themselves across companies time and time again. Finding talent, retaining talent, executing at pace, managing up, managing down. I've tried to share my personal experiences, but in reality, I don't believe there's one-size-fits-all approach to leadership. Instead, it's a mix of common folk wisdom and tactics, and a lot of the stuff I've said is bleeding obvious. But it's still not being done, which is amazing. It's amazing how few people are actually doing this stuff effectively, actually doing anything more than delivering sound bites. Because I believe that great design leadership is easy to understand, but it's bloody hard to do well. So I hope you take all this information, you go out there, and you become amazing design leaders. Thank you very much.